If you talk, you disappear. The words weren't a warning. They were a death warrant hissed into the suffocating darkness of the pantry. Imani's breath hitched, coming in shallow, jagged gasps as the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots vibrated through the floorboards above her head, a predator's drumbeat echoing through the elite Marsh estate. In the oppressive gloom, the only light came from the frantic, spectral blue glow of her smartphone, illuminating a face streaked with dust and the cold sweat of a woman who had seen too much. With trembling fingers, she typed the desperate plea into the void, her thumb hovering over the send icon as the cellar door above groaned under the weight of a forced entry. She hit send just as the wood splintered, the crash of the door sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. Imani clutched the phone to her chest, her crisp white apron once a symbol of her invisible service, now stained with the grime of the crawlspace she was huddled in. She waited for the end, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But miles away, in a glass-walled command center overlooking the neon-soaked veins of the city, Lee Do-hyun didn't flinch. He sat in his tailored black suit, a silent gargoyle carved from ice and shadow, watching the high-tech monitors that mapped his underworld empire. His encrypted phone vibrated once on the mahogany desk. He picked it up, his stoic gaze narrowing as he read the raw, frantic text from a number he didn't recognize, while Dante Knox's men tore through the house above Imani with lethal, mechanical precision. Do-hyun's thumb moved with deliberate, terrifying calm. He didn't know her name yet, and she didn't know his power. But the wrong number had just landed on the only phone in the city capable of stopping a god. He began to type, his expression a mask of focused, predatory intent. Wrong number. Stay calm. I'm coming. The shadow of Lee Do-hyun's armored SUV glided onto the gravel driveway of the Marsh estate, like a dark blade cutting through the mist. Inside, the cabin was a vacuum of silence, broken only by the faint, rhythmic hum of a tablet as Young Sung-won swiped through the thermal blueprints of the mansion. "They've breached the kitchen wing," Sung-won reported, his voice a low mechanical rasp. 4 targets in tactical gear. They aren't looking for jewelry, Chairman. They're hunting. Do-hyun didn't respond with words. He simply adjusted the silver cufflink on his left wrist, his eyes fixed on the glowing dot that represented the wrong number still trapped in the belly of the house. In the crawlspace, Imani squeezed her eyes shut, the cold metal of her phone the only thing anchoring her to reality. Above, the floorboards groaned under a heavy, deliberate step. A muffled voice, distorted by a comms unit, hissed through the cracks. "Find the girl." Knox wants the phone and the witness buried before the police scanners pick up the alarm. A tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She was a ghost in her own life, a girl who polished silver and folded linens, now waiting to be erased by men who treated murder like a chore. Suddenly, the house didn't just go quiet. The air seemed to shift. A muffled thud vibrated through the foundation, followed by the wet, heavy sound of a body hitting the floor in the hallway above. There were no shouts, no gunfire. Only the terrifying, efficient sound of a predator meeting its prey. Imani gasped as the cellar door was pulled open, not with a crash, but with a slow, agonizing creak. She scrambled back into the furthest corner, her phone raised like a shield. A figure stepped into the frame, silhouetted against the dim light of the kitchen. It wasn't the bulky, tactical frame of Knox's men. This man moved with a lethal, feline grace. "Imani Rivers?" The voice was a cool, velvet caress that sliced through her panic. She couldn't speak, her throat constricted by a year's worth of fear. Lee Do-hyun stepped down into the gloom, his tailored suit immaculate even in the filth of the cellar. He knelt before her, the dragon tattoo on his neck appearing to writhe in the flickering light of her phone screen. He didn't reach for her forcefully. He simply held out a hand, palm up, a silent offering of a different kind of darkness. "The wrong number found the right man," he whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a gravity that made the world stop spinning. "I told you to stay calm. I am here." Behind him, Sungwon appeared, stepping over the unconscious form of a tactical guard as if he were nothing more than a discarded rug. "The perimeter is clear, Chairman." The extraction vehicle is idling. Do-hyun didn't look back. He watched as Imani's trembling fingers finally reached out, touching his palm. As his hand closed around hers, the grip was absolute a steel trap wrapped in silk. He lifted her from the dirt, shielding her body with his own as they moved through the carnage of the kitchen. The hunt had ended for the Marsh family, but for the dragon, the harvest was just beginning. Imani awoke not to the smell of lemon polish and old dust, but to the sterilized, ozone scent of a high-tech fortress. She was draped in a cashmere throw that felt heavier and more expensive than her entire wardrobe, lying on a leather sofa that curved like a protective wing. For a moment, she waited for the sharp, demanding ring of Claudette Marsh's vanity bell, but the only sound was a low, rhythmic hum, the heartbeat of a world fueled by data and silicon. "You slept for 4 hours," a voice resonated through the dim light. Do-hyun stood by a wall of glass that overlooked the city, but it wasn't a window to the outside. It was a mosaic of 100 different lives. He gestured toward the glow, and as Imani stood, her legs still feeling like water, she realized she was standing in the center of a digital hive. This was the command center. Wall-to-floor monitors displayed flickering thermal feeds, encrypted ledgers, and live surveillance from every corner of the Marsh estate. "In that house, you were a ghost," Do-hyun said, his reflection in the glass as sharp as a blade. "You moved through rooms like the air, unnoticed by the people you served. To Claudette Marsh, you were a piece of furniture that happened to breathe." He turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a gravity that made her breath hitch. "But in my world, no one is invisible, especially not the woman who holds the key to an empire's ruin." He tapped a glass console, and a central screen expanded. It wasn't a camera feed. It was a digital map of the Marsh family's secret offshore accounts. The red ledger she had glimpsed during her cleaning shifts. Every illicit transaction, every bribe, every cent they had bled from the city was laid bare in glowing crimson lines. Beside it, another screen showed a grainy loop of the pantry she had hidden in. She saw herself a small, terrified figure in a white apron, and then she saw the men who had come to kill her. "They thought they could delete you," Do-hyun murmured, stepping closer until the scent of cedarwood and cold iron enveloped her. "They thought they could send a man like Dante Knox to scrub a stain from a floor. They didn't realize that the moment you sent that text, you became the light that burns them out." Imani looked from the screens, back to the man who had pulled her from the dark. For years, she had survived by being small, by being quiet, by being nothing. But here, surrounded by the pulsing blue light of his authority, the invisible Maid was starting to fade. In her place was a witness with a voice that could shatter glass. "I don't want to hide anymore," she whispered, her voice finally finding its edge in the silence of the fortress. Do-hyun's stoic expression didn't break, but a flicker of something resembling approval touched his eyes. "Good, because tomorrow, the city wakes up to find that the Marshes are no longer the hunters. They are the prey." The digital silence of the command center was broken only by the soft tap of Do-hyun's fingers against the glass console. He didn't look at Imani. His focus was anchored on a cascade of decrypted data streams flowing like liquid gold across the center monitor. Claudette Marsh didn't send men into a crawlspace because of a stolen piece of jewelry or a bruised ego, he said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, analytical precision. "She sent them because you touched the one thing that keeps the rot of this city's elite from smelling." He swiped a hand across the air, and a document titled The Red Ledger expanded, filling the room with a crimson glow. It was a labyrinth of shell companies, offshore accounts, and systematic kickbacks. Every name Imani had seen on the invitations she used to stack on the foyer table was here: senators, judges, and developers all tied to a single, bleeding artery of corruption. Claudette Marsh wasn't just a socialite. She was the city's treasurer of sins. Imani leaned closer, her reflection caught between the lines of illicit numbers. "I saw the folder in her private study while I was dusting the safe," she whispered, the memory of that afternoon hitting her with a fresh wave of nausea. "I thought it was just a guest list for the winter gala, but then I saw the dollar amounts next to the names of city officials." "You found the blueprint of their survival," Do-hyun replied, turning to face her. "The Marshes have been using your invisibility as their greatest shield. They assumed a maid wouldn't understand the math of treason. When they realized you had photographed the ledger, you stopped being a servant and became a liability that needed to be liquidated." He signaled to Sung-won, who stood like a stone sentinel at the door. "The Marsh family has used this ledger to blackmail their way into every major contract in the harbor. If this goes public, the entire political structure of the city collapses by dawn. That is why Dante Knox was given a blank check to erase you. To them, your life is a small price to pay for the silence of a city." Do-hyun reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of the console as he looked back at the data. They wanted to bury the truth, but they made a fatal error in the math. He looked at Imani, his gaze as sharp and unyielding as a diamond. "They counted on you having no one to tell. They didn't account for me." The realization settled in Imani's chest, heavier than the fear. She had carried the weight of the city's secrets on her tired shoulders, and now, for the first time, she wasn't carrying them alone. The red ledger was no longer her death warrant. Under Do-hyun's guidance, it was the match that would start the fire. The silence of the command center was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic chirp of an incoming priority transmission. It wasn't a text, it was a digital intrusion, bypassing the primary firewalls to splash a single video feed across the central monitors. The image was grainy, illuminated by the harsh orange glow of a flare. Dante Knox stood in the center of an empty industrial shipyard, his face partially obscured by the shadows of a tactical mask, his eyes burning with a chaotic, frustrated light. Behind him, a row of fuel tankers sat precariously close to a local power substation. "You've overstepped, Do-hyun." Knox's voice was a jagged rasp, distorted by the transmission. "You're shielding a servant who belongs to the Marsh family. This isn't a mob war, it's a retrieval. Give her back by midnight, or I stop being surgical. I'll start with the docks, then the grid. Give her back, or the city burns." Imani felt the air leave her lungs, the sheer scale of the threat making the floor seem to tilt. She looked at the fuel tankers on the screen, imagining the inferno Knox was willing to ignite just to silence her. "He's going to kill thousands," she whispered, her hand instinctively gripping the edge of the glass console. "Because of me." Do-hyun didn't move. He didn't even blink. He stood with his arms crossed, his stoic silhouette reflected in the feed of the man threatening to incinerate his territory. The light from the monitors caught the sharp line of his jaw and the dark, coiled ink on his neck. He waited for the feed to loop, then tapped his earpiece, connecting directly to the channel Knox had used to break in. "You speak of burning things, Dante." "As if you understand the nature of fire," Do-hyun said. His voice was a low, melodic vibration, terrifying in its absolute lack of emotion. "You are an enforcer who hides behind tactical gear and the bank accounts of a socialite. You think you are a hunter, but you have mistaken a dragon's den for a hideout." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing through the camera as if he were looking directly into Knox's soul. "You will not touch the girl, and you will not touch my city. If you ignite so much as a match on those docks, I will not just kill you. I will erase every trace of your existence from the archives of this world. I will turn the Marsh family into a memory of failure, and I will hunt you through the smoke you created until there is nowhere left for you to bleed." Do-hyun reached out and swiped the screen, cutting the transmission with a finality that felt like a guillotine. The room returned to its cool, blue-toned stillness. He turned to Sung-won, who was already adjusting the slide on his sidearm. Dante Knox has chosen his funeral pyre, Do-hyun murmured, his eyes returning to Imani. The coldness in his gaze didn't soften, but it shifted, becoming a protective barrier. He thinks he can use fear to negotiate. He doesn't realize I've already removed the match from his hand. The blue-toned screens flickered, reflecting off the polished surface of the command desk as Do-hyun moved toward a heavy, reinforced drawer. He pulled out a small, obsidian-black hardware key, its surface etched with a single, unadorned crest. He didn't hand it to her immediately. Instead, he held it between his fingers, the weight of it representing the total decapitation of the Marsh legacy. Power is not found in the weapon you carry, Imani, but in the unwavering certainty of the person holding it, he said, his voice a quiet command that drew her eyes to his. He stepped into her personal space, not to intimidate, but to ground her. Up until now, you have survived by looking at the floor. You practiced the art of being part of the shadows because you believed that if they couldn't see you, they couldn't hurt you. But the shadows only hide you, they do not protect you. He reached out, his fingers light but firm as he tilted her chin upward, forcing her to meet his intense, dark gaze. Look at me, he murmured. When you face Claudette Marsh or Dante Knox again, you will not look at their shoes or their hands. You will look into their eyes. You will let them see that you are no longer the girl in the pantry. You are the one holding the match. Imani felt a strange heat rise in her chest, a mixture of fear and a burgeoning, sharp-edged pride. For years, she had been trained to be invisible, to be the silent witness to others' lives. Under Do-hyun's scrutiny, she felt the invisible layers of the maid's uniform finally begin to peel away. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squaring against the weight of his expectations. I'm tired of being a ghost, she whispered, her voice steadying as she locked her eyes onto his. Do-hyun leaned back, a ghost of a nod acknowledging her shift in posture. He placed the obsidian key in her palm, his fingers lingering for a second against her skin. This is the master bypass to the Marsh's private cloud, their digital vault. It contains the raw audio files, the unedited contracts, and the identities of every silent partner in the Red Ledger. It is the heart of their empire. He watched as her fingers closed around the cold, heavy object. They spent years making you feel small, so they could feel like giants. With this, you become the giant. You decide when the vault opens. You decide when their world ends. Imani looked down at the key, then backed up at the man who had given it to her. The fear was still there, but it was no longer a cage. It was a catalyst. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was the architect of their downfall. The command center transitioned into a theater of war, the air vibrating with the rapid-fire clicking of Sung-won's team as they executed the first phase of the erasure. Do-hyun stood beside Imani. His presence, a stabilizing anchor as the digital vault she had unlocked, began to spill its secrets across the city's major news cycles. He didn't use his own name to fire the shot. He used the truth the Marsh family had tried to bury with her. Watch. Do-hyun commanded softly, gesturing toward the main monitor. The headline broke across every network simultaneously. The silent witness, leaked ledger, exposes Marsh family corruption. Below the scrolling text, high-definition images of the Red Ledger, the very pages Imani had once dusted with a trembling hand, flickered into the homes of millions. Then, the narrative shifted from the crimes to the victims. The media, fueled by the untraceable data packets Do-hyun's hackers had disseminated, began to tell the story of the maid who had survived an assassination attempt to bring the elite to their knees. The invisible girl was no longer a shadow in the pantry. Her courage became the spark that set the morning news on fire. In the plush, high-ceilinged offices of the city's district attorneys and the marble lobbies of the Marsh's corporate partners, the atmosphere turned to ice. For the first time, Imani saw Claudette Marsh's face on the screen, not as a poised socialite, but as a woman fleeing a swarm of reporters, her untouchable aura shattered by the numbers she couldn't hide. "They spent your entire life making sure no one heard you," Do-hyun said, his gaze fixed on the chaos unfolding on the screens. "Now, they can't hear anything else." Imani felt a rush of cold, sharp clarity. The fear that had lived in her marrow for years was being replaced by a terrifying, beautiful sense of agency. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the catalyst for a revolution she hadn't known she was capable of leading. "This is only the first skin," Do-hyun murmured, his hand resting briefly near hers on the glass console. "By noon, their reputation will be incinerated. By nightfall, they will be desperate enough to do something foolish." As the phones in the command center began to light up with frantic inquiries and the stock market reacted to the Marsh family's plummeting value, Imani finally looked up from the floor. She looked into the reflection of the man who had helped her find her fire, and then she looked at the city that finally knew her name. The hunt had moved from the shadows of a private estate into the glare of the public eye, and the dragon was just getting started. The digital hum of the command center was suddenly drowned out by a rhythmic, bone-deep thud that shook the foundation of the fortress. On the perimeter monitors, the cool blue feeds were instantly replaced by the jagged white light of tactical breaches. Dante Knox had found the dragon's den. He wasn't coming for a negotiation. He was coming to incinerate the evidence and the girl who carried it. "Breach at the primary elevator bank," Sung-won announced, his voice a calm contrast to the chaos erupting on the screens. He didn't rush. He simply tapped a sequence on his console, and the heavy blast doors hissed shut with the finality of a tomb. "They're using military-grade thermite. Knox is desperate." Do-hyun didn't flinch. He turned to Imani, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering emergency strobes that had begun to pulse through the room. "The walls are steel, but the man outside is hollow," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the rising storm. "Stay behind me." The hunter is about to learn that he has cornered himself. The first explosion ripped through the outer lobby, sending a shockwave that shattered the glass partitions of the secondary offices. Through the smoke, Knox's tactical team moved with mechanical precision, their suppressed weapons spitting lead into the shadows. But this wasn't a corporate office. It was a labyrinth designed by a man who had survived 1,000 wars. As the hitmen stepped onto the pressure-sensitive tiles of the main corridor, the floor itself became a weapon. Automated defensive turrets emerged from the ceiling with a clinical whir, and the hallway was instantly bathed in the lethal crossfire of a sovereign territory. Imani watched the monitors. Her breath hitched in her throat. She saw Dante Knox through a thermal lens, a ghost of heat and rage pushing his men forward through the carnage. He was no longer the untouchable enforcer who had hissed threats into the darkness. He was a frantic man watching his future dissolve in the dragon's fire. The inner sanctum door groaned under a fresh charge, the metal glowing cherry red as the thermite ate through the lock. Do-hyun stepped into the center of the room, discarding his suit jacket to reveal the full, coiled intensity of the ink on his arms. He didn't reach for a gun. He waited for the smoke to clear, standing as the final, immovable line between the girl and the monster. As the door finally buckled and the first of Knox's men stumbled into the blue light of the command center, Do-hyun moved. He wasn't a man. He was a force of nature, a blur of black and shadow that met the intrusion with a violence that was as beautiful as it was absolute. The siege of the Dragon's Den had begun, but as Imani looked at Do-hyun's stoic silhouette, she realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one who was trapped. Dante Knox was. The air in the inner sanctum was thick with the scent of cordite and the electric hum of overworked servers. As the smoke from the breach cleared, Dante Knox stumbled into the blue-toned sanctuary, his tactical gear shredded and his eyes wide with a desperate, animalistic fury. He didn't find a helpless maid. He found Jung Sung-won waiting in the center of the room, a silent sentinel carved from shadow and steel. Without a word, Knox lunged, his movement fueled by the frantic realization that his world was ending. Sung-won, met the assault with a cold, mechanical efficiency, his movements a masterclass in lethal economy. The two men moved like shadows in a storm, the sound of bone meeting bone echoing against the glass walls. Knox was a brawler of the streets, but Sung-won was the dragon shadow, a man trained to end fights before they began. With a fluid twist and a devastating strike to the throat, Sung-won forced Knox to his knees, pinning the enforcer's arm behind his back with the finality of a closing trap. Do-hyun ignored the struggle, his focus entirely on Imani. He stood by the main console, the obsidian hardware key still glowing with the lifeblood of the Marsh Empire. He didn't step in to finish Knox. He chose a different kind of execution. Dante Knox came here to reclaim his power, Do-hyun said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that carried over the sound of Knox's labored breathing. He looked at Imani, gesturing toward the screen where the Marsh family's primary liquidity, hundreds of millions in illicit funds, sat waiting in a digital queue. He thinks his strength is in his fists. He doesn't understand that his entire existence is now nothing more than a series of ones and zeros. Do-hyun stepped back, leaving the console open. You were the one they tried to erase, Imani. You were the one they called just a maid. It is only right that you are the one who turns their light off. Imani walked to the desk, her reflection in the glass no longer trembling. She looked down at Dante Knox, meeting his frantic, hateful gaze with the steady, unwavering stare Do-hyun had taught her. She didn't feel the need to scream or mock him. She simply placed her finger over the glowing execute command on the screen. For the woman who had no coat in winter, she whispered, the memory of her own struggle fueling the final strike. And for every ghost you tried to create. She pressed down. The screens flared brilliant white for a fraction of a second as the obsidian key siphoned the accounts into 1,000 untraceable ghost nodes. On the monitor, the Marsh family's net worth plummeted to 0 in a single, silent heartbeat. Dante Knox let out a strangled, hollow sound as the reality hit him. He wasn't just defeated. He was broke, unmasked, and irrelevant. The shadow of justice had finally fallen, and it had been cast by the hand of the woman they thought they could break. The sirens began as a distant wail, weaving through the city's concrete canyons until they reached the base of the dragon's fortress. The strobe of red and blue light climbed the glass walls, reflecting off the monitors where the Marsh family's financial vitals had flatlined only moments ago. For a lifetime, that sound would have sent Imani into the shadows, a signal for the invisible to become even smaller. But as the heavy steel doors of the safe house slid open, she didn't flinch. Do-hyun stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, not to guide her, but to acknowledge her. The world is waiting to see who you are, he murmured, his dark eyes fixed on the entrance. Don't give them a ghost. Give them the truth. Outside, the elite district was in an uproar. In front of the Marsh's ancestral townhouse, black government sedans had swarmed the curb like hornets. Imani watched through the tactical feed as Claudette Marsh was led down her own marble steps, her wrists bound in steel, her designer coat draped over her head in a futile attempt to hide from the very cameras she had once courted. The federal agents weren't looking for a missing maid. They were carrying the boxes of evidence Imani had unlocked, a paper trail of treason that led directly to the governor's office. Imani stepped out from the cool, high-tech interior of the command center and into the morning air. She didn't use the service entrance. She walked through the grand, reinforced lobby of Do-hyun's estate, her head held high, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The reporters were there, held back by a wall of stoic men in black suits, their microphones extended like spears. They wanted the story of the wrong number, the story of the maid who had survived the wolves. As she reached the final set of glass doors, she paused. She saw her reflection one last time, no longer the woman in the stained white apron, but a woman whose silence had been bought with a fire that now belonged to her. Dante Knox was in a cage. The Marsh Empire was an ash heap. and the city was forced to look at the person they had spent decades ignoring. She pushed the doors open. The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding, rhythmic white, a digital coronation. Imani Rivers didn't cover her face. She didn't look for a crawl space. She stepped into the light, a witness turned warrior, walking through the front door of her new life while the world she had broken sat in the back of a police cruiser. The invisible maid was gone, and in her place stood the woman who had made the dragon vow. The seasons had turned, and the snow of a harsh winter had melted into the hopeful green of a new spring. Yet the skyline of the city looked fundamentally different. The grand skyscraper that once bore the Marsh name was now the headquarters for the Rivers Justice Initiative. In the executive suite, Imani sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak, looking out over the city that had once tried to swallow her whole. She was dressed in a tailored suit the color of midnight, her presence commanding the room with a quiet, lethal grace she had learned from the best. The invisible maid was a legend now, a ghost story told to corrupt CEOs and predatory politicians to keep them awake at night. Behind her, a bank of monitors displayed the encrypted channels of her whistleblower organization, a digital lighthouse for those trapped in the same darkness she had once occupied. A soft click of the door signaled the arrival of the only man allowed in without an appointment. Do-hyun stepped into the room, his black coat catching the light of the setting sun. He looked exactly as he had a year ago, stoic, unyielding, and impeccably sharp. He placed a small file on her desk, the crest of the Kang Syndicate embossed on the leather. "A new case?" Imani asked, her voice steady and resonant. A cry for help from the docks. Do-hyun replied, his dark eyes meeting hers with a flicker of pride. "A girl in a warehouse. She has the truth, but she doesn't have the protection." Imani opened the file, her thumb tracing the photograph of a woman who looked exactly as she once did, scared, small, and waiting for the end. She reached for the obsidian hardware key that now sat permanently on her desk. 1 year ago, she had been a wrong number. Today, she was the answer. "Send Sung-won," Imani commanded, the authority in her tone a perfect reflection of the man standing before her. "Tell him the board of directors has approved the intervention. We don't just protect her. We dismantle the people who made her hide." Do-hyun leaned against the edge of her desk, the dragon on his neck appearing to pulse in the twilight. "You've grown accustomed to the throne, Imani." "I learned from the man who built it," she said, standing up to join him at the window. They stood together, the head of the city's most powerful nonprofit and the boss of its most feared syndicate. It was an impossible alliance, forged in the heat of a panic text and tempered in the fire of absolute justice. Below them, the city lights flickered to life, 1,000 tiny sparks in the dark. Imani knew that as long as she held the key and he held the line, those sparks would never be extinguished. The protector's vow was silent, expensive, and devastatingly thorough, and for the first time in history, the shadows were working for the light.